Welcome to Decades of Heistery, where we cover safecrackers and bank heists from 1926 up until U.S. involvement in World War II. Our quick hitter stories range from the highs of successful heists to the despair and heartbreak of a cornered robber, with lots in between. We experience a foiled heist, a pastor pleading for a pardon, a parting gunshot from the wife of her handcuffed husband, an Alabama governor doling out pardons and paroles like party favors, a prison escape, one captured crook who takes his own life in despair, and a family that steals together, being arrested together. First up, the Indianapolis Times, January 5, 1927, the second edition of the day, on the front page, titled Bank Robbery Foiled. There was a January 4th safe-cracking attempt at the state bank at Markleville, Indiana. According to the sheriff, Frank Daniels, it appeared that the Yeggs had successfully breached the outer door of the safe. They burned it open, which leads me to assume that they were what were called burners, safecrackers who used acetylene torches versus actually cracking the safe like we've seen in the movies using finesse and skill. According to Daniels, these Yeggs had even started on the inner door, but then had given up and fled for unknown reasons. That reminds me of the main Yeggs that we discussed in a previous episode when a tree branch fell. It took out a power line and apparently made the lights in the bank flicker, and that forced them to flee. So perhaps there was a similar unknown sound or movement that frightened the Markleville Yeggs. On to the Indianapolis Times, a week later, the January 12 edition, where we see the title, Pastor Pleads for Clemency. It's subtitled, Believes Story of Man in Bank Robbery Case. This story starts on February 20th of 1925, when a Lawrence Hurd, that's H-U-R-D, was sentenced to between 10 and 25 years in the state reformatory for auto banditry. That sounds like a really hefty sentence for stealing a car, except apparently that vehicle was then used in a bank robbery. The sentenced Hurd claimed at the time that he was actually visiting his sister in Kentucky during when the bank was robbed. Well, stepping in was a reverend named J.E. Deal, D-I-E-L-H, maybe pronounced a different way. He was a Methodist pastor who was serving Greenfield, Indiana, and for whatever reason, he believed Hurd's story. In fact, he believed it to the point that he appeared in court before the pardon board pleading for clemency. However, he wasn't alone in court. The former Hancock County Circuit Court prosecutor John Ging, G-I-N-G, and the arresting officers at the time appeared to actually fight or prevent Hurd's parole. Well, at some point, board member John C. Cheney grew interested in the case and ended up visiting the Pendleton Reformatory. He even heard from another prisoner who upheld Hurd's story, which to me is, one prisoner defending another is not exactly earth-shattering news. Anyway, resolution for the parole was pending at the time of print, so we'll have to follow up on this one for further information. The Montgomery Advertiser from January 4th, 1927, ran a story in the column 7 all the way at the bottom. It was titled Stage Bank Robbery and subtitled Cashier Handcuffed at Teller's Cage by Bandits, Escape with Cash. The site was the First National Bank at Ellisburg, Pennsylvania, which had been held up at closing time. 2 men entered the bank and handcuffed the cashier to the teller's cage, as the title suggested. The bandits then looked around, scooped up all the cash in sight, and fled in what was called a closed automobile, so not a convertible. The teller and his wife lived on the second floor above the bank in an apartment. The wife heard her husband's plea from downstairs. She bolted to the window, threw the window open, and then she fired a parting shot at the fleeing bandits. We'll definitely need to follow up on this one. The Montgomery Advertiser from Sunday, January 16th provided a story called Brandon Pardons 5 on Parole, subtitled Tom Ford, Girard Bank Robbery Convict Among Those Freed by Governor. Democrat Governor W. W. Brandon, whose term was ending January 17, 1927, meaning tomorrow, issued a handful of pardons and paroles. The convictions had a pretty wide range, but were mostly serious. Receiving pardons, which included the full restoration of rights, were I put it in an ascending level of seriousness. Roy Clayton, who'd been convicted of burglary and sentenced to 2 years. J.S. Powell, who'd been convicted of conspiracy to violate the Prohibition law, who'd been sentenced for an unknown term. Then we have George Lewis, who'd been convicted of what they called assault to murder, and he'd been sentenced 9.5 to 10 years. And the last to receive a pardon was Dick Madry. He was in for second-degree murder and had been sentenced 50 years. Granted paroles were Thomas G. Riddle, who was a former prominent banker, and he'd been convicted of forgery and sentenced 8 to 10 years. A Joe Stone, who had been sentenced for manslaughter, given 8 years. Richard Hamlet, who'd also been sentenced for manslaughter, this was manslaughter in the first degree, who'd been sentenced 10 years. And then a Freeman King, who'd been sentenced to life in prison for murder. 5 of the 9 who'd received pardons or paroles had been involved in the death of another person. And now we meet Tom Ford. Ford had been convicted in Russell Circuit Court way back in 1920 for his involvement in the Phoenix Girard bank robbery. He was sentenced to prison for an unknown term, but had been on parole for what was called several years in the article, the details being a bit sketchy. So let's fast forward to now, to 1927. We see Ford noted as a, quote, trusted employee, end quote, of an English lumber firm located in the British West Indies. Well, Tom Ford had been in Alabama in December of 1926 with his bride on a purchasing trip for that lumber company. On the return trip, before leaving for the British West Indies, Mr. and Mrs. Ford stopped by the Alabama capital of Montgomery. They wanted a chance to see and thank Governor Brandon, as he'd been granted a full pardon with restoration of civil and political rights. He wanted to ensure Governor Brandon that he, the governor, had, quote, given him another chance, end quote, enabling him to, quote, win success and happiness, end quote. The January 31st, 1927 Evening Star brought us a story called Prisoners Flee Jail, subtitled 8 Awaiting Trial in Illinois Saw Way Out. So the story goes, 8 prisoners were being held for trial with charges ranging from stealing up to bank robbery. And they sawed their way out of a Belleville, Illinois County jail during the night of January 30th. When I first read the title, I assumed it meant that the 8 they envisioned or imagined a way to escape, not literally sawing their way out. How did they get a saw? I do not know. Anyway, they did, and they escaped over a wall in the rear jail yard. So they had to have climbed up, I would assume, at least a 6-foot wall, and probably higher, and jumped to the other side. Well, at some point shortly after the escape, the jailer was apprised of the break when other prisoners called out, "Jail delivery!" which apparently was some kind of weird alarm snitch code that they knew to offer. It turns out that a bar had been removed, so they had actually sawed out one of the bars that we see in the movies, and escaped from their second-floor cells on a rope which had been cut from the food elevator. This is movie material. At the time of print, all 8 prisoners were on the lam. The Milwaukee Leader from Tuesday, January 4th, had a front page story that was sad. It was titled, "A Bank Bandit Fears Capture, Kills Self." We'll stay in Illinois and head to the town of Secor, S-E-C-O-R, to learn of a holdup that had occurred at the First National Bank. This had happened the night before, Monday, January 3rd. What happened was a man entered the bank with a drawn revolver. He forced the cashier and a woman bookkeeper and 2 customers into the vault. He grabbed about $1,000 or so from a cashier's teller drawer, and then he took off and fled in his vehicle. Well, as was often the case, a posse quickly formed and apparently closed in on the man, as somehow they were able to identify him through his hunting license. It turns out that Henry Smith of Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, was the robber. He'd been cornered and, out of sadness or fright, had shot and deleted himself. Lastly, we turn to the Cordell Dispatch, Friday, January 21st, 1927. It's titled, "3 Gallion Brothers Arrested in Kansas for Kentucky Bank Robbery." Quote, "The last of the notorious Gallion brothers," end quote, wanted for an October 10, 1923, $75,000 post office safe robbery at Mayfield, Kentucky, had been rounded up and captured after a 3+ year federal officer manhunt. The 3 brothers had been arrested in Manhattan, Kansas, several days ago, according to the article, so the 17th through the 18th. We have Ernest, 35, Eldridge, 25, Carl, who was nicknamed Buster, who was only 21. Well, they've been arrested by local authorities as motor car theft suspects. They were later identified by Postal Inspector W.O. Hollick. Another brother, Sam, who was wanted in connection with this Mayfield, Kentucky post office robbery, was being held in jail in Washington State for motor car theft. Sisters Beulah and Cora had even gotten in on the act and had been recently convicted of shoplifting in Seattle, Washington. A Philip Sopsky, S-O-P-S-K-I, was also being held in Seattle, and he was being implicated in the Mayfield, Kentucky post office heist. Makes me wonder if he didn't have a romantic relationship with Beulah or Cora. That's just conjecture. Anyway, Ernest Gallion had, quote, jumped his bond from Paducah, Kentucky after his indictment by the grand jury. Meanwhile, Carl and Eldridge had eluded capture since charges were brought against them. While this family sounds like serious criminals, there was never a mention or details of the Kentucky bank robbery, as noted in the title, leading me to believe that the title should have read ... arrested in Kansas for Kentucky post office robbery. So this story will have an asterisk until we get more information linking them directly to a bank robbery. Some of these stories will have to remain unanswered mysteries. Others will become follow-ups in the months ahead as more information becomes available. At least one of them was sadly answered unequivocally. So that does it for the quick hitters for January 1927. Next up will be main stories for the month of January, which have a special Southern flair as we go degenerate in Dixie. We'll go to Alabama, Florida, Kentucky, Oklahoma, and Texas for a sentencing, for the death of a prison escapee, for an Okie gone wild, and for a successful hefty heist, and more. For now, I want to thank you for spending your time with Decades of Heistery. Till next time.
Where somebody waits for me, sugar sweet, and so is she. Bye, bye, blackbird.